Lotfan, you can let everybody in now. Okay. Professor Jafari.
Yes, good day or good morning to all of the participants. It's a pleasure to be with you, no matter where we are in the time zone. And welcome to the 15th volume of SCoT webinars. Very briefly, for those of you who have not joined us before, let me introduce the concept and the practice of tourism SCoT webinars to you. This webinar series began out of the realization that the tourism industry and tourism education and tourism research always deals with the formal sector of tourism. Big destinations, big generating markets, a large number of tourists going and coming, mass tourism, big airlines, big charter lines, big hotel chains, everything in mass was being talked about, volumes, trends, and including government and associations. And nobody was talking about the informal sector of tourism, which is actually the bulk of tourism. If we add up the informal sector together, it's larger than the formal. But nobody talks about it. There are little guys with little operations in little communities doing their best. And during this period, and even before this period, nobody was really helping them. If I'm a big company, a big destinations, I know how to go to the government or go to the banks to get money, to get support, etc. So I have all the connections. The big companies, big destinations, big communities have all the resources and connections and connectivities, but not so with formal, informal economy or informal sector of tourism. They even don't know what is the right question to ask, let alone looking for an answer. While everybody was trying to give ideas to the formal sector, the informal sector had to get their advice or news from the media, from the news, that the tourists are coming, might be coming, the vaccine is coming, vaccine is not coming. No plans, no communication, nothing happened. So we said we have to do something for the informal economy, which again works with small communities, or there's small entities in larger communities, doesn't matter. And bring the message closer to home and begin to also focus on the community. In a number of our webinars we have had so far, one of the lessons we have learned is that we need to have the type of tourism that benefits the community. We don't need the type of community that can best serve the tourists. It should be the other way around. Why do we want to do tourism? That is a basic question to ask. It's not just to be in the business of helping the tourists have a vacation or facilitate their travel. It's also a choice economic activity for the community from which they're supposed to benefit, and to be with it and work with it. So this is this webinar series in different voices, by different people, different case studies, different situations. We are coming together twice per month to deal with issues that are interest to small communities and small operators, entrepreneurs, and the like. I hope this is something, well, you are surely joining us because you also believe in the concept that we are practicing. One of the things we did after we began the webinar series, we realized that the formal sector is more fluent in the international language of English. So having webinars in English is no problem for the formal sector by and large. But the informal sector, you cannot say that about it. Some do, some don't. So we even decided to take the message to small communities and small operators and informal sector by using local languages. But of course, we had to be picky and pick the major languages. So we have already done webinars in Chinese, 100% Chinese, 100% Portuguese, 100% Spanish, 100% Persian, and our next one would be 100% Arabic. Not that we duplicate what we are doing in English, would be a different set of speakers, similar issues, but the language is the language that the bulk of the population in the informal economy appreciate. So that was a touch of innovation that we added in order to reach deeper into informal community. And since our webinars are recorded and are available, then always people can go and listen to them at a later time when the informal economy gets together. Excuse me. So once more, I welcome you to the Volume 15 webinar, and I invite you to join us in future sessions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Jafari, for the elaborations. And I can trace what you said through all the last volumes of SCoT webinars that focus on smart communities and the lessons that we have been taking and sharing from small scale initiatives in or within the communities around the world. And the initiative is still ongoing with taking different languages in, because again, it was Professor Jafari's initiative to involve all communities without the language barrier. And we will have our next non-English webinar, which is in Arabic, very soon this month. Me and my colleague, Professor Duarte Morais from North Carolina State University, that he is the founder of a very unique initiative of People First Tourism, that I am their collaborator of Japan People First Tourism, will moderate this session today. And we are going to ask our presenters to start. Our presenters are Leigh Bennett and Marcus, and this is the second volume of this series of resiliency and leadership with the communities that is in collaboration with our Center for Leadership and Inclusiveness in our university as well. Marcus, floor is yours, or Leigh? I think Leigh is the first.
Thank you. Happy to start. Mike, could you share the PowerPoint, please? Kazem?
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay.
I want to move down to my slides. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Jafari. Thank you, Kazem, for the introduction. And I've got a very short presentation this evening, or this morning, this evening, this afternoon, depending on where you are. But I'd like to have a look at the interplay between personal resilience, organizational resilience, and community resilience. And there's a really interesting dynamic that we are seeing, that is very contextual and changes with each situation. So very purposely today I've chosen to compare three industries, one being tourism in small tourism destinations, but one also being in health and one being in community development. And I've done that quite deliberately to just show how different the perception is amongst people, professionals working in those industries, or tourism operators working in tourism, to how they actually connect together. So hopefully you'll get some indication of being able to place tourism in a different context and have a look at. May I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So as a quick introduction, we could very broadly, very loosely say that the sources of resilience come from at least these three areas: our background, our culture, and our lived experiences. And indeed, it's far more complex than that, and often deeply psychological as to our levels of personal resilience. But it is very contextual. If I can show the next slide, please. And here I borrowed from some work of others who've reminded us that resilience is about both personal traits but also the situational state. We very much focus on allowing people to understand their personal traits because we fully believe that personal resilience can be learnt, and it's a series of mindsets, traits, skills and abilities. It's not something we're just born with. And there's some great models that we've looked at to help people, to assist people on a journey, to coach them to develop those skills. But also it's very situational. So it depends on the state. And a small mantra that we've developed is it's not what is in front of me, but how I respond to it, how I react to it. That's very important. So resilience will change through situations. It's a process. It will change across our lifespan. And as I'm about to show, the perception of resilience can shift according to different industries, which in itself is an area that I would love to explore more. We've been picking this up anecdotally and through some of our informal testing in leadership workshops that we run across Australia. And these are very diverse communities. So when I show them to you shortly, we're talking communities that are up to 3,000 kilometres, 4,000 kilometres apart, but have a lot in common with other organisations in similar industries. So if I may see the next slide, please. So a reminder from previous seminars webinars that I've been involved in, that we define personal resilience as your ability to bounce back and recover and respond. And a really critical element of this is that you respond with commitment and optimism. And that commitment is generally around our commitment to our vision, our purpose, our personal vision, but also the vision of an organisation. And in very simple terms, it's why do I get out of bed each day? What is my motivation? And without that, people tend to lack even the most basic elements of resilience. But with a clear vision, we're capable of bringing ourselves back into a more stable and composed state in a shorter period of time. And we've done a measurement of some around about 500 people so far in a data set that's helping us understand their various levels of resilience. If I may have the next slide. And those traits we've borrowed from Duarte Rousseau's model, which is around these 6 traits, of which I'm not going to expand on tonight. But we've developed questions which allow people to measure their vision, their composure, their level of reasoning, their health and well-being indeed, and their tenacity, which is around realistic optimism, and their levels of collaboration and support networks. And those 6 traits or 6 domains are of vital importance, and people generally can make a very accurate and with some coaching a more refined self-assessment of where their personal resilience sits. If I may have the next slide. We also have devised a measurement which I shared in a previous webinar on community resilience. We have a data set now which covers about 30 countries, and with great collaboration through Asia Pacific University and our colleagues online tonight. But we look at 4 facets of community resilience: social capital, those linkages and support networks and structures that communities have; community competence as perceived by the person assessing that local community, the collective efficacy or ability to fix things, to make them right, to take action, and economic development, which is a facet which is reasonably well known to all of us, and of course information and communication, how that is perceived in terms of very good, very poor, or very patchy. Overall there, the lesson is around, we're looking for social connectedness, optimism, community learning, and these features most definitely have to be developed over time. They can't be developed during a crisis or post a crisis. And COVID-19 has showed that communities that have had these in place, have seen it as a process, have done much better. And here in Australia, we've run these resilience leadership workshops in response to cyclones or tropical rainfall, which causes significant flooding across vast areas of the northern part of this country, and also, of course, COVID-19. If I may have the next slide. So the interplay of these three and how each of these three circles, drawn in exact proportions here, shift is really important. And we ask groups of professionals and or tourism operators how they perceive those three being connected, and how they see their own organisational management team or their organisation and its level of resilience. And we ask them to redraw the diagram so that the proportion shows the connection or the strength of the circles, or the vulnerability or lack of connectivity. And it's been a very interesting exercise, very informally done in a professional development workshop, but with some amazing insights. And I'd like to share with you three quite different contexts that this has been done in, and hopefully just ask some questions from that around what does it mean for our understanding of this topic. So the next slide, please. So the first context is particular to this country, but it's about Indigenous health services. And one of the most successful innovations in the last 25 years has been to allow Aboriginal and Islander communities in Australia to manage their own communities, particularly in regional and remote communities. Sometimes these remote communities are 12 to 20 hours drive from the nearest city. So we're talking very vast distances. They're controlled by a community group and an organisation, and they're run as a very significant, very high quality medical service, which mostly employ Indigenous health professionals, administration people and managers. And the context of this, that it's very important that the people in those organisations often belong to those communities or have gone back to those communities or fly in and fly out to those communities. They have family members there. And something very important about the Australian Indigenous peoples and First Nation people here is their connection to land. It's one of the most critical, it's deep, it's spiritual, and it is that dislocation from land that can cause many problems. So all these things come together to give this particular industry a very different set of traits. So if I may see the next slide, I'll show you what I'm talking about. So when asked to redraw the three circles, in my view, perhaps inevitably, because I know the sector well, I work in it an awful lot and run leadership and management programs and accredited programs, but they've drawn it so that the personal resilience is quite closely tied to community resilience. And they've drawn it so that personal resilience is somewhat larger, because if the health professionals can't be more robust, more resilient than their communities, and these are communities that not always, but quite often have very serious health issues, high levels of diabetes and chronic illnesses, and high levels of unemployment and dislocation from sometimes mainstream society. So they have to, if you like, sit to the side of that and be very robust themselves. Interestingly, they have to also contend with the fact that there are often very strong family connections in those communities, but also strong family rivalries, which can create some internal politics for those remote communities. And they have to deal with those, but rise above them to put the organisation first. Hence, they've all drawn from many organisations we've worked with, they've all drawn the organisation resilience circle much bigger than the rest because it is pivotal to the resilience of that community that they're working in. And a particular element of Australian Indigenous peoples is that face-to-face communication and relaxed and informal talking and storytelling is the most important element of communication. So if I may see the next slide. So the second industry is a very well known one to many people, no doubt, is the community development sector. And this was from a series of neighbourhood centres, which are centres that are run literally in neighbourhoods and localities. And their vision is, or their purpose is, to look after the most disadvantaged people in their communities. So they have a particular focus on homelessness and on assisting people who might be aged, assisting people who have come from different multicultural backgrounds. But most definitely, the interesting thing here is how they perceive themselves within that and the inclusivity of their engagement and their needs analysis and how they work with their communities. And if I could see the next slide, I'll show you quite a significant difference in the way the three circles are drawn. So in this case, they are closely tied as an organisation to their local community by definition. They must carry out appropriate services for that community, just as the Indigenous health services have to do. But they see themselves as somewhat more separate because they don't necessarily live directly in that community, mostly do, and they most definitely don't have that same level of interaction with family members. They're separate from that. So they've basically drawn their personal resilience very much in similar proportion to their organisational resilience. So they're perceiving that the organisational resilience is the most important thing, and they must be resilient in turn. In a recent sample of a group of 20 that I worked with last week, when I flew up to a particular location, a small city of about 90,000 people, they had the highest levels of personal resilience I've measured in all the work that we've been doing over the last several years. And I tested that and just tried to see whether that was authentic or whether they had misconstrued the survey. But they were very resilient people. And indeed, they carry a lot of vicarious stress on their shoulders. In other words, they take on the stress and the disadvantage, if you like, of their community and work very hard to overcome that. And hence, they do need a lot of personal resilience. So if I go to the last one, which of course is smaller tourism communities, and the context here in this country at present, if I could see the next slide, please, is that Australia's been very fortunate. It's managed COVID very well. So the vast majority of the country, perhaps 80% of the population, but certainly 95% of the land or the territory, have only had a 6-week shutdown for the entire period of COVID. So we've been back to fairly normal for domestic tourism in many locations since September last year. In fact, it's very hard in this in regional locations at the moment to be able to afford to stay there because the rates have almost doubled. So tourism is doing particularly well, which is quite interesting. And again, these are destination management organisations, which again take on this vicarious stress of caring for their industry base, caring for their community, and seeing themselves as critical to it staying vibrant and robust and resilient. So in a period where there's a lot of stress around, where international market destinations have come to a halt, domestic tourism has absolutely kept these places going. So it's very interesting if we see their perception on the next slide of, and again, a very different drawing, and whilst these might seem quite superficial proportional drawings, they're actually labelled with many things when we do them in a workshop. So again, the personal resilience is very important, but not as important as the previous slide. They do see that organisational resilience, that the destination management organisation, a small community, must remain strong, must have stayed composed, not become too stressed, not taken itself into a very red zone of panic during COVID or any other crisis. In fact, we're facing crisis here all the time where I'm flying in 2 days' time, there's a cyclone forming, and that community will already be making preparations for that cyclone. People just move on with what the challenge might be. And they've perceived that their community resilience, in their eyes, of course, being the tourism industry as a community, not the broader community, is very significantly robust. And the measurements we've done on the 4 facets, the slide I showed earlier, highlight that. It's very even, and the DMOs, the tourism organisations, believe that they've been very important as a linker, as an information provider. In fact, it's nothing to receive up to 2 to 3 or 4 even digital communications from these organisations each day, as I'm connected to many of them, as they put out information to their industry base. The communication, one could argue, is too much. One could never argue that it's been too little. So what's interesting here, I think, is that tourism, at least in the context of these 6 or 7 smaller regional tourism destinations, is in a really well-balanced, stable situation, and is in some respects quite helpful, but nonetheless is underpinned by a lot of uncertainty, a lot of unknown. But most of these destinations are getting considerable amounts of money thrown at them by our federal government, the central government. And of course that helps an awful lot. But many of them have to still rely on their own resources. So that's all I wanted to cover today, trying to give an indication that there's a really interesting dynamic between each of these 3. And whilst I haven't touched on it greatly, the levels of inclusion, the levels of diversity, and the inclusive practices by each of these 3 industries are all on a scale that I would put of 1 to 10 very high. They are membership-based, or they're stakeholder-based. They're certainly client, patient, or operator-centric. They work very closely to the people they're meant to be serving. So all of them have very high levels of inclusion, and I think that's maybe part of their different perception, but also collective levels of great success, not just last year, but against many adverse effects. And thank you.
Thank you, Leigh, very much. I want to just save the time and ask Marcus to continue with his presentation before we have Professor Nakamura's. Marcus, please.
Thank you, Kazem, and thank you, Professor Jafari, for that wonderful introduction to this seminar. And I'd really like to thank Leigh. One is I always really enjoy Leigh's work, and 2, he finished off with saying a very key word, which is around perspective. And the work that we do at Insight into Impact is indeed based off of the perspectives of stakeholders. And really what we are doing is bringing a bottom-up approach to organizations, to communities, to improve decision-making. And so in essence, really what we focus on in Insight into Impact is improving stakeholder engagement and organizational decision-making. Next slide, please. And so what we've actually done, and one of the things around how we describe our approach, what our why is really about placing community input into the heart of decision-making. And so to do that, we've actually coined a term, perspective analytics. And again, just taking a step back, whether we're talking about, personal, organizational, or community, we've really sort of have based our IP around the ability to contextualize our process to really gather those perspectives of various community members, of beneficiaries, and as can be coined also as stakeholder groups. Next slide, please. And so really when we're talking about whether corporate resilience and community resilience, really what we are communicating is the data that we have obtained from these various community members, from these various stakeholder groups, because quite often what we see in the community sector and the nonprofit sector is that it's a lot of storytelling. Storytelling is absolutely fantastic, love it. But one of the problems with storytelling is quite frankly, is a lot of organizations and representatives use the stories that best fit their narrative. So at Insight into Impact, we actually gather the data from community members, from beneficiaries that support stories, or they may actually contradict that storytelling. It all depends on the data. And we utilize data visualization, graphic representation to really demonstrate really what that data is saying. And so what are some of the problems that exist with some of these organizations? You know, we see a lot of times that, you know, they're trying to depict a narrative around product recognition and what the value of their services are and what that impact is on the market. Again, if that storytelling is not necessarily lined up with the perspectives of the community, then really that its impact on the market could be quite negative. You know, moving on to strategy, we really want to, our process really kind of determines, you know, what the best strategy is for various community organizations and our corporate clients as well. Because again, we are really de-risking situations, right? So with any issues and challenges that exist in sort of that community environment, what we want to do is identify the issues and challenges. And by understanding what that organization or that community, that council group is doing well, we're actually able to give them a strategy forward. And that strategy, based off of our solutions that we run through our platform, will have a high probability of success. And again, what can be achieved with this, and again, it depends on if we're looking at the perspective of an organization or a corporate client, but you can actually achieve, whether if it's a corporate client, some market growth, because again, now you are de-risking the issues and challenges that your product or service have previously held. And now you're actually able to understand the responses that will achieve better outcomes. You know, one of the major issues that I have with a lot of work of corporate clients is that they often talk in outputs, right? And so they're talking about how much money they've spent, how many people they have touched, and how many initiatives they have supported. But you know what that means? Absolutely nothing unless you're having a positive impact. You need to be talking in terms of outcomes. And by talking in terms of outcomes is how you can really sort of make sure that you have achieve resilience and minimize risk and really sort of create a more inclusive environment. Another thing that I'm going to, in the next slide here, we'll go into a bit further, is about funding. You know, one of the things that we really talk about is how our process can assist community groups with achieving that funding, because we're actually able to demonstrate the value of that initiative and show, you know, why it's been successful and why it's not been successful. If you could just go back for a slide, please. Thank you. And so anyway, just, and we'll get into this stuff here in a bit more detail. So what do we do at Insight into Impact, right? So what we do is to actually to help with resilience, to help to de-risk situations, to help communities build resilience and be more inclusive. We conduct impact measurements. We improve communication and collaboration. We help identify market opportunities. And again, this isn't just for clients and community. It's one of these things where if you understand your community members, if you understand your beneficiaries, you're able to have these bottom-up approaches that really identify what sort of responses you need from decision makers, right? And so as a result, that drives strategic direction. One of the things that we're most proud of is that we help a lot of organizations and we help various community groups really align with the Sustainable Development Goals. To our audience out there, if you're not familiar with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, I really suggest that, they're right behind me, as a matter of fact, and there's 17 goals there. But in reality, there's actually 167 targets. And so these 167 targets make up the 17 goals. And what these sustainable development goals are is really a standardized approach for making communities and different regions and so forth more sustainable. And so another thing about our process that we're quite proud of, whether we're talking about the IRIS Plus categories, which are for impact investing, the Closing the Gap initiatives, which are quite common over here in Australia for Indigenous measurements and so forth, is that we're also able to assess against these other standardized processes. And what's the bottom line? The bottom line is that we improve outcomes. And how do we do that? Is by simply listening to the perspectives of various stakeholder groups. I guess I just want to give this analogy, is that it's like going to a doctor and you tell them that your head hurts, and so they write you out a prescription, right? But if you don't really get into detail and really start to explain what problems are going on with your headaches and with your vision and with your smell and maybe with the neck, then that doctor is not going to be able to diagnose as well. So do it into impact. Simply, what is going on in your community? Why are you having problems with this contact going on? Algorithms through the platform that we use, we're able to diagnose improved outcomes. Next slide, please. So overall, if we're talking about corporate resilience, what do our outputs achieve? As I mentioned, create these new market opportunities and drive growth. But when you're talking about community resilience, this is very important because of the fact that, again, you're able to better understand the market better, right? And so another thing this our solutions do is it's able to inspire, attract, and retain top talent. Now, why is that important? Regardless if you're working in a community sector or for an organization or for a corporate culture, more and more as this culture around consciousness and around corporate social responsibility grows, more and more people are making their purchasing, and they're actually deciding to work for those who are more aligned with sustainable goals and focuses, and they want to be aligned with organizations and communities that have a social and an environmental aspect to them. When we talk about, we also want to talk about enhancing brand value and the value of stakeholders. But moving on, I think one of the things that's most important, especially when we talk about understanding communities and so forth, is that when we're talking about social and environmental impact, we really want to be aware of not just what a company or an organization is doing in our community, but we also want to understand their supply chain, right? It's no longer good enough just to say that you're being sustainable. You also need to ensure that the supply chain of these other organizations are also following conscious and responsible behaviors. And again, how do you do this? It's through transparent and accountable actions. You just can't go onto your website and say how wonderful you are. You need to actually be able to measure your impact and demonstrate your outcomes. All right. And so what does this all mean? So if you are a community organization who's relying on grants, or if you are a social enterprise that's relying on grants or funding or investment, you really need to be able to give your funders confidence and demonstrate your impact, right? And so again, how do you do that? By understanding the perspectives of the community members or the beneficiaries or the stakeholder groups that are influenced by your product or your services or in your community and so forth. Next slide, please. So just if you can go back one, please. Okay. Sorry about that. Yeah, sorry. So anyway, just real short, I guess one of the things is that, again, outcomes-based measurement using an evidence-based approach to understand what is going on in the community, ease of use, Something that we talk about all the time is how important it is for simplistic language, for simplistic to really support the ease of community members, regardless of education or professional status, to be able to participate in our process. The fact that they're anonymous is very, very much supported. Real-time reporting, this is to improve decision making and to actually get improved outcomes as soon as possible. It's no longer good enough to wait to the next funding cycle or to wait until it's the thing on the news or in the media cycle. Real-time reporting is going to achieve these outcomes and assist with that resilience and that inclusiveness all the better. And again, utilize existing frameworks such as the Sustainable Development Goals and so forth. Next slide. So to sum it all up, an impact assessment will help you understand the community better. It will help you give a culture check to your community organization or to your business, and it will allow you to evaluate your impact on your community honestly. Over here in Australia and as in most countries, a lot of times you have social impact assessments that are done really as a tick the box exercise. It's not really done as a forward-thinking document, and that's exactly what it needs to be. Next slide. So I'm just going to quickly here. We've done when we talk about tourism, we've done several tourism projects. I mean, currently we have one going off in Oman, and we've done one in Jamaica and one here in Australia. But I wanted to use this example of here in Sierra Leone, and just to talk a little about the ease of which it is to actually try to get community impact if you really try to understand the purpose of your organization. And so for this case study, what we had was a social enterprise based here in Australia, and they had been working in Sierra Leone for about 6 or 7 years. And the problem is that they were focused on education and they were focused on hunger, but they really didn't understand all the challenges that their students were having. When you think about this from a tourism perspective, quite often as decision makers, we want to go in there and sort of think that we understand what the problems are. Oh, we have this education and we have this great ability to diagnose an area, but again, we're using bias and we're applying bias to our view, our perspective of what needs to happen in this area. So again, you need to ask those who are influenced by your decisions about what they really think. Next slide, please. So by simply asking, I can go on to the next one. Sorry about that. So simply by asking the students that were impacted by this project in Sierra Leone, we were able to really on the fact, the reasons why they were actually having trouble with their education is that the fact that these kids had to walk to school every day. So unbeknownst to this organization here in Australia, where normally the kids can only use one pair of shoes each year, here it was realized that because these kids walk to their classrooms so often that they would actually need 2 pairs of shoes. Many times they're often wearing out their sneakers halfway through the year. Another challenge was around understanding the fact that, that many of their family members were suffering from different health-based factors and so forth. And that there was also a need for more of a financial stipend that this organization wasn't paying enough. And on the surface, often as a social enterprise, you go in there to do a job, but if you're not able to account for the complexity that actually occurs in these various communities, then your sole purpose is never going to really be achieved. And so for this particular organization and for this particular project, they were able to go back to their funders and say, look, you've given us X amount of money and we have achieved all these wonderful things. These kids have had a lot of great outcomes. However, if you could please finance us a bit more, we can have things like getting them a book bag, getting them an extra pair of shoes and so forth. Next slide, please. So again, what we were able to do for them is really to understand the fact that they really had a lack of basic needs, and what it actually meant by the payment of school fees, and actually relate that to a positive impact rating when it came to the sustainable development goals. And this is that standardized approach that I'm talking about. All the time you see different multilateral organizations or different consultancy companies coming out with them. The consulting company ones, honestly, that's just really trying to make a name for themselves. But the ones, especially with the sustainable development goals, or IFC has a good one out at the moment. This is something that you really want to align yourself to, and it really sort of gives you a direction in what you're evaluating. Next slide, please. So here what we were able to do, and again, this comes back to that whole challenges thing that I was talking about before, is that you need to understand the relationship between challenges that are being faced in a community and how that then results in impact. That middle component is the response of the organization, or the response of that individual person, or the response of that community, as actually even demonstrated by Leigh. And by giving that some contextual relationship and understanding how these different responses are going, will again allow you to formulate a solution that will help you based off of a personal response, a community response, an organizational response. Next slide, please. Here's really just showing the fact that, really at the end of the day, but just by simply asking these kids in Sierra Leone about the impact of this organization, we were able to understand that not only and again, this organization was just out to achieve literacy, but we were able to demonstrate that these kids reported, greater mental well-being, increased goodwill, increased confidence, more stability in their lives. And again, this is something that you can take back to funders or to a town council or to an organization and say, look, this is the positive impact that I'm making. And therefore, especially when we're talking about resilience and inclusiveness, more people are willing to support it, simply because you now have an evidence-based approach or an outcomes-based evaluation of what you're doing well, right? Quite often, organizations are not brave enough to look at themselves and say, what are we not doing well? Everybody always wants to tell you how good they're doing, but it's those who truly want to make a difference, those who truly believe in being conscious and truly believe in resilience and de-risking situations, who will look at themselves honestly and tell you what they're not doing well so that they can improve their response to those issues and challenges that are being experienced at the community and or stakeholder level. Next slide, please. And so here, based off the approach that we use at Insight into Impact, we are actually able to tell this social enterprise called the Fig Tree Trilogy exactly what problems remained. And I'll be honest, they, among all the clients that we had, they were just so overwhelmed and so happy that we were able to lay it out for them and say, look, here's what you need to do in order to continue to provide education and address hunger and so forth. And they honestly, they were able to take this and go and acquire more funding. And so as a result, they became more resilient as an organization. They were able to de-risk many of the problems that they had with their existing beneficiary base, simply because they asked their beneficiaries, they asked the community members what challenges they were experiencing and how that resulted in impact. So I think that's all for me today. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marcus. I think your presentation is just drawing the map, how we can bridge the community and academia, how we can develop indicators to see what is going on and what is happening in the community, and how we can, more importantly, translate it in community language level, or what can be in between. I'm going to save the time again and just ask Professor Nakamura, who is a doer, who is a practitioner in the field, and ask Professor Nakamura to share with us from his experience and expertise. Nakamura Sensei, お願いします。
Yeah, do you want to hear my experience?
Yes, please.
Yes, I'm originally ecologist working on insect population dynamics and also Satoyama and Satoumi, how to say, conservation and reactivation. Do you know these members know Satoyama? What is Satoyama?
Please explain a little bit. They don't know much.
Okay, Satoyama is in short, it is farmland and forestry land. In Japan, we have more than half national land belong to Satoyama, and Satoyama is human controlled production landscape. And in Japan, we are facing decreasing birth rate and decreasing population and aging population. And this challenge occur mostly in Satoyama area, so local area. So Tokyo area and Osaka is still increasing population, but many local areas that is formerly agriculture and forestry area. So now we are facing population problems. And then I realized the importance of Satoyama in Japanese people life. But we are facing challenges, as I told you. So I start human capacity building training school in Noto Peninsula. Kazem knows much about Noto Peninsula, and I guess he will show some movie today.
Yes.
And it is Noto Peninsula have a very excellent traditional culture and nature of Satoyama. But as I told you, we are facing a challenge of population problems. So young people move to urban area. So population of the local area is decreasing. So we need a young human capacity who will shoulder the future of the area. So I start Satoyama Meister Training School. It is not a university and not a high school. Our trainees, working people. So we establish a training school at the tip of Noto Peninsula. Yeah, I have been doing this. I started this program 2007, and still program is going on, and we have 200 graduate already. This is outline of my my practice in Noto area in Japan. And also recently, 6 years ago, I started the collaboration and exchange with Noto Peninsula and Ifugao Rice Terrace, Philippines. Ifugao Rice Terrace is very famous tourism spot in northern Luzon Island. Ifugao Rice Terrace is designated as UNESCO cultural heritage, and also designated as globally important agricultural heritage systems, so GIAS. And the Noto Peninsula also designated globally important agricultural heritage systems. And Noto, as I told you, facing serious population problems. And Ifugao also facing problems. Population of Ifugao is still increasing, but young people move move from Ifugao to urban area and abroad. And also uncontrolled tourism is prevailing in Ifugao area. So Ifugao rice terrace, World Heritage is deteriorating and collapsing. Some part of the rice terrace already start collapsing. So UNESCO has nominated Ifugao one of the endangered heritage systems. Fortunately, such a designation already over, but condition is not much improved. So I started the human capacity building school in Ifugao too, and Noto and Ifugao start the exchange and collaborations. So we call it GIAS twinning. GIAS is globally important agricultural heritage systems. So, and I have just completed my project, human capacity building training program in Ifugao. So over 6 years practices. We have 100 trainees graduated. This is just a very rough outline of my practices. Okay, Kazem, is it all right?
Thank you, Nakamura Sensei. What I found very interesting when I worked with Professor Nakamura at Kanazawa University as a postdoc fellow when I was in United Nations University was that what Nakamura Sensei initiated is the nature school. The students are those who are working and they are not really adapted to urban lifestyle. Within that group of students, I even found some medical doctors, for example, and then the initiative taken by Professor Nakamura and his group to let these people meet with community leaders in local community and experience what is the real local lifestyle and local livelihood. Sometimes visiting a place looks very nice. You see fresh air, fresh food, and very kind of slow life, far from urban population and urban pollutions. But in reality, if newcomers want to adopt rural lifestyle, or if they even want to migrate into the rurality, they are not accepted by local community as easy as it might looks like. So Professor Nakamura's initiative was opening the door and the window to the people who are interested to meet the right person within the community, to get the right training over time. So each, let's say, Satoyama Meister program was about 1 year, if I'm right, Nakamura Sensei, right? And each month you had 1 or 2 training class or event, and as Professor Nakamura mentioned, 200 people who are graduated. How many of them actually they moved into the rural and Noto Peninsula, Sensei?
You like to know how to say a percentage of how to say
graduate
immigrant from urban area to Noto?
Yes, within those 200 people.
About 30%.
30%.
70% of the trainees from the local area, so resident offspring of the local people, and about 30% migrate from urban area, and then find some job, and then settled Noto Peninsula. Yes. And local young people and migrant youngs from urban area have a network and collaboration very well. This combination is very important. This is our our specific future of the training.
Great.
And one more important point is variety and diversity of the people. So not only farmers, but also ecotourism promoter and school teachers and a lot of different kind of the young people study together and start the networking. This is very important. And well, also not just a rice terrace farmer, many different kind of the young people come to the same place and study together.
And actually what I found very unique in this program was conducting a workshop or training for community was a challenge. I was always thinking as a part of academia, how I can train community who they know better than me about their own community. And we have a lot of program like community building or community training and so on, how we build a community that is already built and developed for hundreds of thousands of years. And we are just a new member of the community. And with Professor Nakamura's activity, I found that these graduate people who moved in, they are the best case studies and example. When we have a workshop, we just ask some of them to present what are they doing back in the community, how they start a new lifestyle and livelihood. And these case studies were the answer to my question. And I found that a solution that I tried to learn these lessons from Noto Peninsula and copied in Kunisaki Peninsula in Japan, that Kunisaki Peninsula also became or designated as one of the World Agricultural Heritages of Japan a few years after Noto Peninsula, from the lessons that I learned from Noto Peninsula. Another initiative that I feel pity if I don't ask our professor, thank you, Nakamura Sensei. I want to ask Professor Duarte Morais, because he also is leading a very unique initiative that I tried to get lessons and do some part of what he's doing in Japan. We created a small scale of what he's doing, people first tourism in North Carolina area. And I found that he could enable local markets and develop them. And just in some, maybe we can say he helped people to reach out. Can you elaborate a little bit about the People First Tourism Initiative, Professor Morais?
Yes, I'd be delighted. And I've been taking notes as the previous session in this series. I'm just ferociously taking notes because I'm learning so much. And I was thinking, if you would like, I could ask a question to each speaker after that. Yes. Does that sound good? So yeah, so I'll briefly kind of segue these three presentations with describing a little bit of what People First Tourism does. So about 10 years ago, or until about 10 years ago, I was more of a traditional researcher, at least the American style researcher, that, you know, we have to search for grants that support our labs where we have students and they have to pay tuition. So we need to pay their tuition generally, unless we have students that come with some kind of scholarship, but that's relatively uncommon. And so it becomes kind of, thanks, Kazem. So the profession turns into chasing study grants. And then when we look for those, often they have a geographic focus. So we're here in our campuses, looking around our state or the United States, looking for funding sources. And we kind of are shopping around the world for problems to be answered. And that makes us not area experts, and it makes our research very transactional or cross-sectional. You know, we often go and visit with local colleagues. Fortunately, in academia, all of us are very collaborative. And so I've benefited from collaborating and borrowing insights from people from many different regions, been bringing my own kind of salad of insights from around the world. But I felt a little limited from this approach because I then wouldn't have a long-term relationship with informants, with participants. And I then, you know, when I came to NC State, start noticing that if I study here in North Carolina for a long period of time, then my ability to get depth of insight increases. But my focus is with underserved people. I feel like that is the crux of some of the limitations of tourism. So I study micro-entrepreneurs, people that are kind of the informal sector and evolving into the formal sector of tourism. They make destinations genuine, competitive, and equitable, because then the locals are earning income and they are starting to have a voice in the decision-making of that destination planning. But those individuals, they can't afford to just keep going to plenary sessions, to city hall meetings, to answer surveys, and then, you know, not really benefit, because for people of vulnerable livelihoods, time really is money. And so we've decided, my colleagues and I, about 10 years ago, to engage in action research, where we have large group, or a couple of hundred now, people in North Carolina, in our state, that our company, peoplefirsttourism.com, helps them get visitors and helps them sell farm products and crafts. And by doing that, we have this ability to stay engaged with them long term. And then our students, research assistants, they interview these people periodically. So we have now data sets along almost a decade of about these 100 or 200 people, because they kind of come into the study and they leave, but a lot of them stay with us long term. And so that's given us a greater depth and a greater understanding of the problem of these micro-entrepreneurs that are generally invisible, and they're kind of trying to stay invisible so that they don't get too much attention from local authorities or from the industry, that then they might get in trouble because they're not really sure if they're complying with all the policies. And they're making money somewhat informally. And so this has worked out very nicely, in the sense that we're now doing research with this panel of local tourism micro-entrepreneurs for almost a decade, and publishing about it and supporting them. And just as the metric from some of our colleagues, our key metric, actually, Professor Nakamura mentioned, you know, his main metric is how many people then move into rural areas. And with People First Tourism, our main metric is how much money have our participants earned directly from their engagement with us. So we're a strange, complex ecosystem that includes online capitalism with very kind of altruistic and rigorous academics. So, and maybe sometime I'll have the chance to elaborate more, but if it's okay, Kazem, I'll jump onto a question to each panelist. Does that sound good?
It's good. Do you want to watch the video first, or we just
sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a short break that during which we watch a video from one of the marginal villages that Professor Nakamura introduced me to that. And make sure to move your bodies, stretch, and come back fresh. Meanwhile, if you haven't replied to our questionnaire, the survey online that Lutfan Jeffrey has sent it to you, please do so, because your comments and questions are valuable for us, and we are here to answer you if we can make time within this webinar or not, after that, we will definitely contact you. So let's watch the video together.
Kazem, we can't hear the sound.
Oh, really?
My name is Silvia. I'm from Italy. I found Shuran no Sato when I was randomly looking on internet. I really wanted to experience the essence of Japan. For me, traveling is not just coming to a place and take photos. I really want to get to know the people. We had some traditional local food, seasonal food, roots and mushrooms from the forest. You could feel the essence of the place. It was just like being in the forest. We took our bikes and we rode to the rice fields. Once we arrived, we were given little plants of rice. From now on, every time we will see another rice field, we are gonna look at with different eyes because we know what's behind. What's behind is a great feeling of connection that you have with the local people because you do something that they normally do, that they have done for ages, for centuries, but also a feeling of connection with the earth. After a few months, it's gonna give us something back, something that can be absolutely important for people who live here. So I would love to come here and see my little plants that they have grown up and see how big they got. I'm so happy. This is just like a dream that comes true. Definitely one day, sooner or later, I would love to come back.
Thank you, everyone. And I hope you are fresh, energetic back to start a very more loud discussion. So this is a dream. The village was selected as a BBC World Challenge, shortlisted in one of the top 10 challenging place. And the number of guest houses, when Nakamura sensei introduced me to village, was about in 2010 6 or 7 guest houses, and now they have about 40 plus guest houses. And one of the indicators I borrow from the Marcus lecture about the community social capital, it was when I asked people why you start a new guest house, they said because the community leader, Mr. Tada, that you saw him in the video, because he recommended. So it means I could take it as a very high level of trust between the communities. Also in Leigh's presentation, I saw you were emphasizing on organization and organizational capital. So I found that the housewives, they're taking reservation in their kitchen. They have their own fax machine, and then they are really organized, and this institutional capital is very high. So let me give the floor to our colleagues, Professor Duarte and Professor Jafari and Professor Cooper to do this question and answer session. Yes, please.
Thanks, Kazem. If Jafar Mal can allow me, then I'd like to share a question with Leigh to start with.
Please.
I was really intrigued with the notion of community resilience. And I noticed a comment, Leigh, in regards to the standard of care of, there was that interesting case study of local health providing organization and economic development organization and tourism organization. And you mentioned that at some point that the tourism organization, they were kind of caring for the tourism sector, not necessarily the whole community. And I wonder if you can reflect on that. In a sense, we would like to think that the tourism is taking care of community. And if the tourism development authority is taking care of the local tourism sector, then they are taking care of the community. But would you please reflect on whether that is the case, whether you felt like these organizations are all feeling like they're taking care of the host community, or is there a difference, in kind of how these organizations feels ethically what their mission is? Are they trying to help the local hotels survive, or are they trying to help the local community thrive a little bit better, borrowing economic strength from tourism, let's say?
Yeah, that's a very good question. A very complex one to answer too, I think. Look, the reality is it changes a bit. Many would be and are serving their entire community, but some of the destinations that I was doing that aggregated example for tourism, for some they have very diversified economies whereby tourism is quite small in comparison to mining or other industries. For others, tourism is the dominant industry. But regardless, their mission, interestingly, on the leadership programs that we conduct, we now run leadership programs for across all sectors. And that has come about because we've had so much interest from people who aren't from tourism to come to them. So we have purposely opened the door to everybody, and we find that much more inclusive. It's a much richer discussion. And also, tourism sometimes can become a little bit too focused on itself. So look, part of your answer, part of your behind your question, I guess, is people inevitably are looking more broadly, but the way that destination management organisations are established in this country, at least, or in most of the states in this country, they very much have to deliver for that industry, and sometimes they get overly focused on it. But inevitably, there's an overflow and an overlap.
Thanks, and that's my feeling is that that's something that we need to kind of dig into and examine if that's happening, because as you mentioned, they're even legally sometimes bound to really care only about the destination. But perhaps this pandemic has changed things or has unearthed this problem, because at least here in North Carolina, the hotel industry really struggled. And so as a result, their funding sources of these tourism authorities has collapsed. And then as a result, they have reached out to the local government and to the state and federal government asking for relief funding to benefit the community. But have they really been benefiting the community? Does that make sense? So if these organizations have not been stewards of the well-being of their host community, why would you now use community tax revenues to help survive, you know, a sector or an agency that's representing the sector. So the other thing is, I guess the feeling is this awareness and this shake up of the tourism industry making room for a change at this level. Just another pick for you to kind of consider as you kind of reflect back on your experience. Here, there's a change of guard in the influence of the informal sector, because tourists are still afraid of going to hotels. And so the hotels, they were the ones earning overnight tax, and then that tax was funding these agencies. But now vacation home rentals from private people, like through Airbnb, for example, those are rising as perhaps in some places they are the highest earners of tax that are still funding these agencies. And I've just heard from some of the local destinations that for the first time they will have individual homeowners in the board of the tourism destination authorities, that the boards that used to be only occupied by formal sector representatives of the industry. Does that make sense? Do you see any of that changing?
Yeah, may I respond to that? It's very interesting. And I think the big question here is the impact or the effect of funding models on, you know, a connection with your stakeholders. So what your question has brought out is that I hadn't mentioned that most of the destination management organisations or local tourism organisations are either self-funded through tourism operators paying some membership fee, but most of them get money from the local council, and most of that would be on, it's not a great amount of money, it'd be on a per population basis. All of them get money from the state government, and all can apply for bids from the federal government. So some, for instance, are having injections of tens of $1 millions as we speak because they've been hit by international tourism collapsing. But others, I've had 28 flights in the last 3 months. I'm flying all the time. I'm paying twice the amount for a room, so it's very different here. Rooms are at a premium. The places are full, and they're charging twice what they were just 6 months ago. So it's, again, a very different dynamic, and so it's very hard to compare, I think, some of that. But most definitely, the funding model, I think, is fundamental to the robustness and sustainability of a lot of tourism organisations. And taxes in this country are not something looked on very favourably at all. Very few destination management organisations or local tourism organisations benefit from taxes. Those are the envy of the others, but very few do that because the industry, tourism operators are very strong in resisting that. Let's say. So it's really interesting. Different countries, different locations, very different models and different impacts as a result, good and bad.
Yeah. Thank you. Kazem, do you want to follow up with other questions to Leigh, or? I have just a question for Marcos and for Professor Makamura as well, but I don't know.
Yeah, please go ahead, because I just
you're looking at the results from the form.
Yes, from the form, and also I'm looking at the time. So let's move on to Marcos and Professor Nakamura. Yeah, please go ahead.
So Marcos, really enjoyed your presentation as well as in the first webinar as well, of course. The focus on stakeholder engagement is great. I remember fondly just 6 months or so ago, I went to a workshop here in Raleigh about the planning for a city park, and the city planner said the city can serve all if all are involved. And so it's very noble of you to be focusing on highlighting the voices of the less heard people. Now, in your work, I was wondering if you could get a little bit more granular, because you pointed to something that's difficult to accomplish, to get not just breadth of data, but to get depth of data, right? And so in some folks are talking about deep data instead of just big data, right? And I'm getting the sense, I mean, I definitely got the notion that it's important to do outcomes-based assessment and leveraging the Sustainable Development Goals from the United Nations system. So that's a proven framework. So I got to that point of like what to ask about. But I was wondering if you could elaborate, even for example, on that example from the school, the fig tree children. How do you go about getting enough information from them, right? Because to come up with those questions, they are probably not fluent in English, and it's difficult for people like us to overcome our privilege of life to understand the problem of having 2 pairs of shoes per year because we have to walk this much. So how do you get to know what little question, to ask? How do you come to that point? Do you use mixed methods? Do you hire local field research assistants that help you, translate not just to the language, but to the context, the kinds of outcomes that you're looking for?
Yeah, good question. So for that particular one, I guess there's a lot to unpack there, actually. I guess I want to begin with just saying that when it comes to getting the diversity that I'm looking for, right? Because that's one thing that we hang our hat on, is the fact that we feel that a lot of organizations only want to include certain pockets of the community, right? And so what we actually utilize is community champions. And so we actually work with community champions that people trust in different socioeconomic cohorts to help us gather data. And there's various ways of doing that. But when you talk about the fig tree children and so forth, and this even comes back down into the depth of data, is that our IP is based off of sort of our inquiry process and then our analytical process. And so we actually gather data in a qualitative fashion, but then we turn it into quantitative insights. And that's to improve decision making. The reality is that when you're dealing with corporates or even at the community level, decision makers need a 1 page, right? And that's just the reality. And so we do a lot of data visualization, a lot of graphic representation and things like that to really sort of simplify, because what most people would maybe write 30 pages of text, we try to give them then that data visualization and a little bit of text here to sort of provide that context. Getting on to the point around how do we get that data in the Sierra Leone case study, really for them, and quite often, again, our IP is based sort of around our inquiry process, but it may be around a sustainable development goal target or around, collaboration or capacity building or whatnot. But for that particular one, we actually, instead of using Facebook or WhatsApp or QR codes like we do quite often, we actually had to use local surveyors where they actually did know the local language. I mean, we could do our process in 80 languages, but I forget the local language there. I do apologize. But we needed someone there who, plus when you're dealing with children, that's another sort of ethical issue, as you're aware. So we needed someone that they trusted. Again, that kind of comes back to that community champions. And there, in that particular instance, we sort of altered our IP a little bit. And what we had to do, because what happens when you work in some of these communities that are emerging, is that they're quite often afraid that they're going to say the wrong thing that will cut off their benefits, or that they're going to say the wrong thing and you're going to get mad and so forth. So we had to actually alter the questioning there and talk about what is being done very well and what is something that could be done better. And that's kind of not always how we ask it, but it was quite effective because we still had the sustainable development goals in mind when we sort of set up our process. So we were still when we were looking at our data and analyzing it, we were still keeping in mind factors around, the education and the hunger components, which we aligned to two sustainable development goals that were based off education and one that was based off of hunger, in essence. So.
Thanks, Marcus. So before I look forward to asking my question to Professor Nakamura, but I wanted to point out how behind Leigh's kind of high-level conceptual presentation and Marcus's as well, there's these intricacies, you know, and in the case of organizational resilience, funding of those agencies is fundamental because that shapes kind of what they can do and how they are able to do it. And then with Marcus, you talked about just the kind of high-level stakeholder engagement with people with mute voices or whose voices are seldom heard, but their voices really inform strategy much better, and you have to quantify those, and then it comes down to the field to actually be able to do that well so that those teenage children can talk about the things that really affect them without fear that the village chief or that the schoolmaster would be upset. And you need to, I think you even mentioned anonymity in one of those criteria. So those kinds of things, how you execute those thoughts are crucial. Okay, and then my last privilege is to ask Professor Nakamura a question. And I'm really intrigued with your experience. I collaborate with a colleague from the Hiroshima University of Economics. And he's kind of helped me understand a little bit rural tourism micro-entrepreneurship, rural tourism lifestyle entrepreneurship, where there's these people, some of them in Japan, some of them are non-nationals, like actually Australian, New Zealanders that come to Japan for the scenery and the adventure sports, and they fall in love with your rural areas. And then the way for them to stay and be liked is to start businesses that are helpful to the local community. And then another example he studied was a woman that was from urban areas, and she was into nature, and she was a chef. And so she went to rural areas and started doing like forest-based foods. And that was how she was able to stay. So this kind of we related this to the notion of lifestyle entrepreneurs, that they move to rural areas and they want to live the life that they idealize. They're making that move for the sake of their lifestyle. And they usually are a bridge between the urban tourists and the rural people that sometimes don't understand the tourism markets as well. Have you observed some of this happening in these communities in which you work? And to what degree do you embrace that in your human development schools in the Sotoyama work?
Professor Nakamura, you are muted.
Okay. From our Satoyama Master School, graduate work in tourism. Many, not so many, but more than 30 people are working in tourism. But their job is very diversified. Some of them are working in local government and support the local tourism. Or someone become a tourist guide, and someone starts a small business by himself or herself. So there are very different kind of tourism they consider. And tourism, big company in Tokyo or other urban area, also want to look for the business in local area. And then there are many different kind of the tourism are now going. And then which kind of the tourism is, which kind of tourism succeed? It depends, I think. So Kazem showed the video. That is just one style. And such kind of, agriculture tourism or traditional style agriculture tourism, that is, former style. There are many different kind of, local tourism. So if you give me other chance, I will prepare the, data and exact information.
Well, if I can just...
Actually, many urban people living, for example, living in Tokyo, want to move to local area, local Satayama area, like Noto. And how say, but they must earn money in formally, how say, retired people want to, retired people living in Tokyo want to move to the local area or to have a second house. But recently, younger people want to move to urban to local. But the problem, very fundamental problem, how to get to the job and how to get money. In local area, there are not so many jobs. So young people must move to urban area to look for the job. And now under COVID infection, how say, risks, some companies in Tokyo want to have a how say, a remote office in Noto area or other Satayama areas. But this is just a start. And we are wondering whether such a remote office how say succeed or not. We are now watching the change.
Great. Yeah, so you also mentioned briefly that you do these workshops and these courses integrated with some local people and some outsiders. I wanted to say that the rural people are smart to be very suspicious of urban people, because for many, many generations, rural areas are kind of taking advantage of. So it's very wonderful that you are, thinking about that in the structure of your workshops. And from what you're saying, it sounds like even integrating ages, right? The older people in the workshops with slightly younger people to try to create those bridges for collaboration. Because we've seen across today that social capital, the collaboration between people, builds resilience. So it's very interesting. And I think from my observation and listening to you, some things are happening in Japan that are a little bit specific to Japan, but this new way in which people flow back to the rural areas and how they're trying to escape the stress of urban areas, but they still need to make money. But the existing economies in rural areas can't really support them. So the way that these things are happening in the United States and certainly in Australia and New Zealand and back in Europe is a little bit different, but also some parallels. So back to you, Kazem.
Thank you, Duarte. I was just reviewing the memories that the photos that I tried to share was the training programs that Nakamura Sensei hosted in Noto Peninsula, involving local community to benefit actually from not only tourism, but also the training that Kanazawa University was conducting on Satoyama, because Satoyama is their landscape. And when academia were getting benefit from Satoyama and educational aspects of Satoyama, we could learn how to involve local community and how to make a mutual benefit in between. If you let me, Duarte, let me move on to Professor Jafar for wrap up the session. And at the same time, I want to thank everybody who contributed to the survey. I got a lot of good results. Let me just share what I'm going to send to everybody after a bit of retouching. So these are the 3 questions that we ask people to share with us. So we have countries and 1 issue, then how it was responded with the community that they're familiar with, and what are the lessons that can be shared. So as Professor Jafari order us always to cook something as a lesson or take out lesson, we are going to process this information and post it on the website. So please come back to the webinars website in scotwebinars.org and .com to get your souvenirs after the webinar. And I'm just going to pass the floor to Professor Jafari, please.
Well, Kazem, maybe it's better if Malcolm goes first because he has prepared a summary of the conclusions of the webinar. Is that correct? Would you like to go first?
Yeah, I saw Malcolm was writing very hard. Malcolm, you are muted. You're muted, Professor Cooper. Yeah, okay. We can't hear you, Malcolm. Yes, now yes. No. Not yet.
Well, maybe we can change place with Malcolm. I go first, and then Malcolm would figure out to turn the microphone on. A very impressive set of presentations. Lots of diversity, but then lots of commonality. We use different words and different terminologies and different cases, but the message was almost always the same. I think it was Leigh who said interplay, used the word interplay. Yeah, it was a lot of interplay of lots of things in this webinar, whether it was the case of Satayama or the case of Aboriginal people of Australia or Native Americans that Duarte, I thought he would mention by name. He did not, but he's working with Native Americans. You see, it's the same things, different names. And we went to different places, you know, Sierra Leone, etc. But again, always just looking for the same thing. And the idea was to really understand the resiliency of people at personal level, community level, organization level, etc., in order to make things to move in favor of the community. One of the terms that wasn't used, but I think you all talked about it, is how to empower the community. Empowerment is something that we use in anthropology more often. All of your ideas was to empowerment of the local voices, local people, so they take ownership of what they are doing. And I think this was demonstrated quite well to increase the level of engagement. I mean, if they're empowered, then they engage, right? And not the other way around. And then resiliency would be the outcome of that. And if we engage the community fully in tourism, which is really the intent, then the essence of hospitality comes out. Hospitality comes from the heart, not from the mind. So if the community has its heart in tourism, then hospitality will be extended to the tourists, and they would enjoy it. I thought this is just fortunately we have taped this panel. It's a perfect panel for the graduate students or undergraduate students to watch and say, okay, what messages are you getting? What individual or collective messages you are getting from this diverse presentation that have tons of commonalities with each other. And I think Duarte, you did quite well by quoting other people, by saying that tourism benefits all if all get involved. And that was really the intent of this involving the community so that everybody benefits, not in name. And something we have to change, and I think I heard the situation of that, we have to change the mentality from outcome versus income. If it is always the intention is income, then we forget about the outcome. So the two have to be in the mind of the community and in the mind of the entrepreneurs, community, and organizers behind it. So outcome is very important. In order, if the outcome is good, then there will be income. Excellent presentation, and I thank you all for contributing to the collective thinking on tourism for the community. To me, if we should ask, why do we do tourism? We do tourism to serve the community, not vice versa. So I give the microphone to Malcolm to bring the pieces together. And I invite you to our future webinars. Again, it's always the same subject: small communities, small operators, empowering them, bringing them in, having them engaged, working together, and expecting them to, helping them to improve their offerings and engagement. Thank you very much, Malcolm. Go ahead.
We still can't hear you, Malcolm. Maybe you can use your computer's mic instead of your headset. Can you try?
How's that?
Yes, now it's good.
That's better. Wow. Sorry, I wasn't trying to avoid the task of being a rapporteur, but we don't have a lot of time. I'm going to tell you that within the next 2 days, I will prepare a report, which we will circulate and we will use to inform our next few webinars. I guess what I'd like to add to Jafar's excellent summary is that I got something out of tonight that I wasn't expecting, and that is the different views of resilience in different organizations and different communities. And I thought Leigh Bennett brought that out incredibly well. And it's good to see a breakdown of what resilience actually means to people. And then you can move on and do some work on it with the community. Also, with Marcus's presentation, many of you won't know that my other career is city planner. I've been a city planner for a very long period of time, before I was even a tourism professor. And one of the things that we were mandated to do was to get local citizen participation in decisions that were being made about land use. And Marcus has come up with methodologies for doing that and for getting the data that we actually need, because it's incredibly difficult to get a community to actually express itself. So I found that those two things from tonight were very, very important to me anyway. The breakdown of what resilience means and how do you bring forward citizen participation in the real world. Professor Nakamura talks about that in terms of Satayama, and I've been to his operation in Kanazawa with Kazem. Fascinating use of social and environmental capital to inform communities as to what they should be doing in terms of tourism and indeed in terms of their lives. So I guess there isn't any time really to develop many of these things, but I will do this in the report that's due in a couple of days. I'd like to leave you with the idea that if we understand the contextual relationships by looking at the real world, especially the small communities, we will actually have much better outcomes for those communities in the future. Okay? And I do apologize for the technology problem.
And Kazem, if I may add just one final comment to collective message that we have put across. 99% of our discussion was community resident involvement, resiliency. It was always about the community, which is really the theme of the webinars. But if we do what we said we should be done at community level, then the tourist would have a better experience. Here's another outcome that is very important. So working together, the tourists have a better experience. They even stay longer. We did not talk about the length of a stay. People come to wind down in the rural communities, and we find enough things for them to do, and they get this large experience with them back, which is much larger than other type of short type of tourism, or mechanized tourism, organized tourism, etc. So there are a lot of values for the host community and the tourist. Everybody would be happier.
Thank you very much, Jafar. Actually, what you mentioned is, I can say, the translation of a Japanese recent initiative just before COVID of decentralization of tourism development from urban to rural area, because rural Japan is not as expensive as urban Japan. And by these long stay programs in rural Japan and volunteer tourism, they try to utilize what you said as a policy for decentralization of tourism development in Japan. The last but not the least, even if I know you guys have seen this, our website, I want to re-emphasize that I want to thank our technical managers, website managers, Mr. Imami and his group, that they do the wonderful job of communicating of our website. Please visit our website, and this is the next webinar that is coming soon, 13th of March. We have another webinar that you can learn from communities in Indonesia. Our moderator is Professor Noel SCoT, and his teams are going to deliver the webinar. So please do not hesitate to write to us if you have any question, and don't forget to register for the next webinar. And we are looking forward to see you on March 13th. Once again, thank you so much, all of you, and especially Professor Jafar, who woke up at 3 a.m. in the morning and accepted our invitation for being with us in this journey. Thank you so much. I love you all.
Thank you, Kazem.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Saeed.